Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm finally getting around to doing a retrospective on a series that I've been wanting to do ever since I started this channel, and that series is Power Rangers. With this starting off a retrospective series here, talking about Season 1 of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the original season of the show, which I believe is the first time I'm ever doing a full-blown retrospective on something even older than me, but again, I was a massive Power Rangers fan when I was a kid. Some of my earliest memories of any form of media is me watching Power Rangers Lost Galaxy when I was 4. I really just adored the series for years after that. And while I eventually grown out of it, I did eventually come back and refound my love of the series around the time of the 20th anniversary. However, again, that faded away once again. However, here we are somehow at the 30th anniversary of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, to where I feel like it's the perfect time to finally getting around to starting my series of retrospectives on these, which again, like my reality TV retrospectives, I'll probably do these yearly, where next year I'll do Mighty Morphin Season 2, but again, this will primarily focus on Season 1, which as a whole is obviously a very nostalgic season for a lot of people. It is a season that started it all, that made Power Rangers this household name that it is now. However, I've personally never liked Season 1 of Mighty Morphin that much, where, again, like taking in the context when I first started watching the series, I started watching at the time of Lost Galaxy, where following that we had seasons like Lightspeed Rescue and Time Force. I really loved In Space at the time, these seasons that had these really solid overarching storylines, which Mighty Morphin Season 1 really doesn't have that. It's mostly a series of a lot of these one-off episodes that have this lesson of the day, and that has the same structure of the Rangers doing something kind-hearted, followed by them fighting putties, followed by them fighting a monster, then them using the Megazord. Like, it is the same structure over and over again, which is why I obviously don't connect to Season 1 as much as, like, obviously people that probably watched it when it originally came out. However, again, it's still a very interesting season of the show to analyze, particularly from a production standpoint, where, if you don't know, Power Rangers is not an entirely original product. It is essentially an Americanized version of Super Sentai, a Japanese tokusatsu show, which is where all the footage of the Rangers and their Megazords come from, with the entire concept of Power Rangers essentially being to use that footage and then film new footage with American actors and be able to construct a storyline by mixing these things together. A concept that's always been fascinating to me, as well, at first you can watch Power Rangers and look at it as this really cheesy kid show with terrible acting and weird action sequences. I think when you analyze it a bit further, it's really fascinating to realize why certain decisions were made, like seeing the footage that they had to work with and seeing how they pieced that together. It reminds me of my love of reality TV storytelling, where obviously a main focus of this channel is reality TV, and something I find so fascinating in the storytelling of it is that, again, it is this concept of using this pre-made footage and piecing it together to tell a story, and Power Rangers feels like it's kind of in a similar vein, though obviously through a more scripted lens. But overall, this entire concept was concepted by Haim Saban, who later owned the property for years afterwards, having created the idea after stumbling upon Super Sentai. And supposedly this was an idea that had been floating in his head for a while, originally planning on using the Super Sentai Bioman, which aired in 1984, meaning that he essentially had this idea for 8 to 9 years before it actually ended up occurring, where I believe the story is that he would pitch this to executives constantly, only for it to be continuously shut down, until we get to 1993, where the show finally becomes a reality. Being an extremely low budget show, obviously having most of its footage come from Super Sentai, so obviously it saves a lot of costs in that sense, while also they notoriously paid the actors extremely low wages, which might play into something that we'll talk about in the following season. But really, I feel like that's a lot of the reason why Power Rangers even came to be, just due to the fact that it was such a cheap show to make, as it's really a show that does seem insane on paper. This show of these teenagers who were given powers by this floating head in a tube and his robot sidekick to face off against the Wicked Witch of the West who lives on the moon, and they're given these spandex suits that has them fighting off really ridiculous monsters, and eventually those monsters grow for them to fight them in dinosaur inspired machines. Like, all this is insane, yet somehow the show worked. And I think a lot of that is credited to the fact that this was obviously an action series. It had a lot of martial arts in it. I feel like that is something that was really unique at the time, especially a live action show, where really in reality, rewatching season 1 here made me realize that really a lot of season 1 is just playing off these typical tropes that you would expect in most given young adult TV shows. However, it has this added aspect of these fight sequences, which I do think really added to the appeal to the show at the time. Now, to run through most of my thoughts on this season, I do want to run through it in chronological order, where I feel like here we should start talking about the pilot, which episode 1 of the eventual show is named Day of the Dumpster. However, there was also an original pilot that was not released to the public initially. However, it was later during the Lost episode, which happened years later, where really the pilot and Day of the Dumpster are pretty identical episodes. They are mostly the same, especially from a pure plot perspective. However, there are minor differences within them. Now, the actual characters are all the same, mostly acted by the same actors. However, there's a major difference in that Trini, the Yellow Ranger, was played by Audrey Dubois instead of Thuy Trang, to which she was largely just kind of fine in the role. I believe she did leave due to the low amount of pay, which makes sense. But again, both episodes do start with us on the moon with some astronauts opening up a dumpster, I guess, to which Rita and her minions end up escaping through. Rita Repulsa, obviously the main antagonist of the overall season, which is obviously inspired by the Wicked Witch in the West, and Rita is obviously a really iconic villain here, though strangely, again, all this footage here used for Rita is Japanese footage. It is footage of the original Japanese actress. However, her lines are dubbed by Barbara Goodson, who has the iconic Rita voice, though it is just strange how every single time you see Rita in this series, it is clearly dubbed over. And even beyond that, also, I should mention that the overall film quality between the Japanese and American footage is a radical difference, to where you can clearly tell when they cut in between, which I do think in the modern day, from watching recent Power Ranger seasons, it's definitely a lot more difficult to tell. I think the footage looks mostly the same between the Sentai and Power Rangers. However, back during these OG seasons, you can very much tell every single time they cut to Japanese footage, which with that, I guess I should mention the original show that this took footage from, with that being Koru Sentai Zyuranger, the 16th Sentai series, which makes it this funny dichotomy of how Japan and America look at Zyuranger very differently, obviously, with Zyuranger being the source of Power Rangers from a US point of view. However, in Japan, it's just a random Sentai series. But again, Rita was the original villain in that series, her character being named Bandora, with her henchman being exactly the same as well. And the overall Sentai ends up being focused on dinosaurs, the Zyurangers themselves having come from dinosaur times in that series, though obviously here they instead replaced them with just generic teenagers. But finally, this is where we get introduced to the actual main cast of the show, with the pilot and the actual episode differing in where they meet up, where the pilot is focused around this bowling alley where a gang ends up harassing Kimberly, to where this leads to a fight there, while otherwise in Day of the Dumpster we have them at the now iconic juice bar, where you see each character getting their time to show off their one character trait, with Billy instantly coming off as this nerdy guy, Jason leading the karate class. We get the introduction of Bulk and Skull, these joke characters for the series that are these bullies that eventually turn around and probably undergo the most development out of any character from the original season here, though obviously they end up having that arc over the course of 6 seasons. But really in season 1, they really are just this generic bullies that do these dumb things that are used for jokes, and really it doesn't feel like more depth is given to them until at least season 2. But with that, I guess we should stop down and just talk about the Rangers themselves here, as this is obviously where they're introduced. So let's start off with Jason, the Red Ranger, who is obviously the leader of the team, played by Austin St. John. And I always liked Jason as a kid. However, I feel like on the rewatch, he does just come off as this generic do-good that doesn't really have much complexity to him. And to be fair, that's really most of the original cast here, though. Jason obviously gets more to do, considering he is the leader. He does get more focus on, especially later on in the season. But there's not really any development for him. There's no true arc for him, though he does really embody the role of a leader pretty well, with him seeming to be the one that keeps his optimistic nature in moments where everyone else seems more hesitant. Next up, talks about Zach, the Black Ranger, who is essentially the second in command. While it's never explicitly said, he is the one that's leading the morphing sequences when Jason's not there, and Zach's always been a likable character in my mind. I mean, again, another one that doesn't really have much growth, though he's probably the character that we see failing the most, where at least it makes him feel a bit more normal, particularly in terms of his later attempts to swoon Angela. And again, he's a pretty fun-loving character here, one that constantly dances and uses those dance moves as part of his martial arts techniques. And overall, I do find him to be one of the more likable original characters. With that, we move on to Billy, the Blue Ranger, who obviously ends up being the person that stays on the series for the longest, staying until Zeo, with no other original Ranger making it out of Mighty Morphin. But Billy, again, is a character that there's not much depth to him in this first season. He really just comes off as this nerdy character that lacks self-confidence at points and eventually finds confidence in himself. He also gets a lot of credit for creating a lot of random gadgets, and that does lead to some ridiculous moments later on. But really, again, Billy's portrayal in this first season here does just come off very stereotypical. Next up, we have Trini, the Yellow Ranger, who I will say, out of any of the original characters here, Trini is probably the one that they do the least with. I just never really clicked with Trini's character. I mean, she's one that is essentially this generic do-good that we constantly see her leading these humanitarian efforts. But really outside that, it really feels like she's just there to be like the best friend to Kimberly and also to explain Billy's more technical talk at points. But outside of that, it's like I just don't really feel like we got much from her on this season, which I think is a shame, especially considering the tragic death of Tui Trang and how it makes you want to remember her character more fondly, but really there's just not that much there for her. I guess I should also mention the fact that the Black Ranger here in Zach obviously ends up being an African American, while the Yellow Ranger here in Trini ends up being an Asian American, which is not a good look based on stereotypes. However, it has been said that this was a mistake that they didn't realize at the time, which, to be honest, I do believe, as we do see in the pilot, it was Audrey Dubois that was there instead of Tui Trang, and I feel like this was an honest mistake, but it is a pretty bad mistake to make here. And finally, we do have Kimberly, the Pink Ranger, who is largely fine. Like, obviously, her original portrayal is as this generic Valley girl, though I do think she becomes more likable as the series progresses. And obviously, again, she's one of the people that stays along the longest, to where she does get more development over time. And obviously, like, at the time, Kimberly was a pretty popular character due to the fact that a lot of people seem to have crushes on Kimberly. But really, outside of that, I just feel like Kimberly, again, like the other characters here, just comes off kind of fine. But eventually, the story progresses through an earthquake occurring to where Zordon, this floating head inside of a tube that's supposedly stuck in a time warp, tells his robot sidekick Alpha 5 Rita is back and that he wants Alpha to bring him overbearing emotional humans, to which Alpha says not teenagers, which is stupid, right? Why of all the people in the world you're picking these teenagers as these people to protect the entire planet? It is stupid, but again, it's Power Rangers. Zordon here obviously ends up being the mentor figure for the season, and really the seasons that come, staying on the show until the beginning of Power Rangers Turbo. And obviously he's a really iconic character. I mean, does he really do that much and have that much depth? Not really, but again, the ridiculousness of the Rangers getting their orders from this do-good magical wizard portrayed to us as this head in a tube is a really notable aspect of the show. And along with that, we obviously are introduced to his sidekick in Alpha 5, the annoying robot that yells out I all the time. However, again, another really iconic character, one that stays on the show for just as long, and obviously ends up being the character that does more physically than Zordon, doing the things that Zordon's not able to do, and also just comes off as a likable presence on the show as well, though again, another one that doesn't really get that much depth to them. But here we do have Zordon, or Zoltar in the pilot, giving the Rangers exposition to make us realize the threat that Rita is, and gives them their power morphers, telling them about their Zords as well, only for Zach and Kim to instantly seem to not believe him, wanting to leave. But again, Jason does show the qualities that do make him a good leader here, and him trying to convince the others into turning around here, seeming to want to go through with this. But eventually, this does lead to them being ambushed outside the command center by a group of putties, sort of foot soldiers for a season, which are just kind of fine, which is like one of a billion times we see the Rangers fight them unmorph across this season, again becoming this kind of generic trope of every episode to have one unmorph putty fight, which again kind of added to the appeal of seeing these unmorph fights, something that we don't see as much in the modern day, as one, it's probably cheaper to not do it this way, but also I think the Rangers in the modern day don't have the expertise in martial arts like this original cast seemed to. But again, like throughout this series, we do get a lot of fight sequences with putties, with this being the first one of them, to where they're overpowered by the putties until they decide to use the morphers, to which we get the first morphing sequence, again iconic here, in them saying it's morphing time and saying their dinosaur names in order to morph. a sequence I've always remembered loving as a kid. Though something strange about this is that after they morph, Zordon's like, well, screw the putties, let's teleport them to fight Goldar in the middle of the city, which is just stupid. And obviously a lot of this is done because of Sentai footage. Obviously the Sentai footage had the Rangers fighting Goldar in the city, and they used that footage here. And it just felt like they didn't want to bother using the actual suits to film American footage on location, though. And we do later see them morphed in footage, though I do wonder if, like, did they just not have the suits at the time to where they didn't want to bother, or was it just pure laziness, as again, it is kind of stupid. But again, the Sentai footage moved from this point on, and both the pilot and Day of the Dumpster are exactly the same. A fight against Goldar.
Rita's second in command, who is by far the most important of Rita's henchmen here, being used pretty often in having him face off directly against the Rangers, particularly the Red Ranger. And while he does come off as a massive threat early on in the series, he does start to become a joke character over time, though again, in comparison to the likes of Finster, Babu, Squat, and especially Scorpina later on, he is by far the most iconic and most notable of the henchmen here. Now the fight here does start at the top of a building where we see them fight in their suits for the first time, and this is followed up by Megazord footage,
which they fight Goldar with as well. And this is kind of weird considering this is the first episode of the Megazord fight in the Sentai. However, in that series, it wasn't until episode 5, while here they do it in the premiere, which I guess, like, considering this is again a pilot for the entire series, it is probably pretty apt for them to do so. But the Megazords in particular being just a cool concept in my eyes. Like, while it is kind of dumb that, yeah, they defeat a monster when it's small, then they grow to the point where they call on these machines that form together into a humanoid mech that they're able to control. Like, it is ridiculous, but I've always found it really cool. I've always loved the Megazord transformation sequences, and obviously this original Megazord is very iconic, even though the fight here is just kind of fine. And the entire episode obviously ends with them agreeing to become Power Rangers, except for Kimberly, who tries to fake them out, saying that she doesn't want to join because the helmet ruins her hair, which is just a stupid joke. But that ends the premiere. Again, a nice introduction to the overall series. So following this, we get a large series of filler, where really the overall story of Mighty Morphin doesn't actually progress until episode 17, where every episode in between is really these one-off filler episodes that, again, like, have some nice moments within them. They're not all entirely bad. However, it is just filler, which has been a major reason why I've never really connected with Mighty Morphin, to where really, I mean, throughout the entire season, there's not really an overarching storyline. It's really just these Rangers fighting off against Rita's monsters whenever she sends them, with not much true stakes to a lot of it. But again, there are some notable filler episodes throughout this. I mean, most of the filler episodes do focus around one specific character and giving them an arc over the course of that episode. Like episode 2, High Five, focuses around Trini, who's scared of heights and through that has to overcome her fear of heights by the end of the episode. But also this ends up being an episode that is just very strange, as it's one where, again, like, despite the fact that the entire concept of the show seems to be based around using this Sentai footage, there's not that much Sentai footage here. It really is like the very tail end of the episode where they finally use it. And really a lot of it just ends up being these fight sequences of putties in the middle of nowhere, where we get one of the most awkward unmorphed fights in the entire series in my eyes, where Jason decides to pick up Zach and Kim and spin them around to kick the putties, which is just a ridiculous visual. Now, episode 3, Teamwork, does have us get introduced to the environmentalist aspects of the show, and also introducing us to Principal Kaplan.
And I guess I should mention the teacher characters in the show, with Kaplan and also Mrs. Appleby being these prominent figures on this season that show up in a decent amount of episodes, though straight up they don't really do that much from a plot perspective. They're simply just there as they needed teachers to be on the show, as they obviously spent a lot of time in their high school.
But this episode has the girls being upset at the guys for not wanting to work as a team, to which by the end they obviously do, and they are given the power weapons, which is the first time they end up using them, which that sequence in particular as well has always been one that's stuck with me. But again, not too much important going on there. Episode 4, Pressing Engagement, ends up being our first Jason-focused episode, where Jason's about to break a bench pressing record, only for Ernie, the owner of the bar, to get distracted by food because he's overweight, and they find that funny, I guess. I mean, due to that, Jason loses his record, which is just stupid. Which I guess I should talk about Ernie as a character here, with him again being the owner of the juice bar here, him essentially being the secondary mentor to the Rangers, essentially being their mentor through real life situations, where I believe the original concept was that Ernie was going to be Zordon in disguise, though eventually obviously that got scrapped, and they decided to specifically want Ernie as an overweight person just so they can make the joke of haha, an overweight person owns a juice bar. How funny is that? Which it's like, it's not though, is it? So I just found the overall like concept of Ernie as a character be weird, though he is a pretty likable figure while he's there. But again, this episode does have Jason being separated from the other Rangers and having to fight up against King Sphinx, who I feel like is a pretty iconic villain. And here they are given the power crystals, which I don't get the point of them. I mean, it's implied that they're used to form the Megazord and I guess give it more power, though again, we saw them form the Megazord before without them, so it just feels like this extremely generic upgrade, but whatever, I guess. Episode 5, Different Drum, is an episode that focuses on Kimberly, who's helping this deaf girl, who later gets captured by Rita and ends up helping them in their fight, and kind of this generic story there, though I will say this does end up leading us to an interesting quirk with this season in the fact that you will notice that there are a lot of points where the Rangers are helping out kids, and those kids eventually get involved with Rita's schemes. And a large reason for that is because, again, this is a connection to the original Sentai, where in the Sentai, Bandora, the Rita counterpart, is a character that is kidnapping kids. Doing so due to the grief of losing her own son, which is a major aspect of her character in the Sentai, though again, that's not really an aspect of Power Rangers here. That's a large reason why these kids keep on getting involved in these plots. To connect the Sentai footage together, they had to involve a kid, to which their explanation for using those here is simply that the Rangers are helping them out, so which is why this happens numerous times here. But following this, we get to one of my favorite filler episodes, a filler episode that I actually watched a lot as a kid. As I remember as a kid, I had a VHS tape of the episode Food Fight, which it's really mind-blowing to think back to a time where VHS tapes only had one episode on them, but it was literally just Food Fight, and I watched this episode over and over and over again. And it's a ridiculous episode. It's one of the most surreal episodes to rewatch nowadays, where it's like, how is this actually an episode that made air? But it's just really funny to watch it, where for some reason they're holding this cultural food festival where each of the Rangers are showing off their heritages with all the foods that they're selling. And obviously Bulk and Skull, being Bulk and Skull, start a food fight, to which it ends with the principal getting his hair blown off by a pie because I guess they think that's funny. But the monster for this episode ends up being Pudgy Pig, a really iconic monster in my eyes. One that its goal is to eat all the food on Earth. But here we also get like other really weird segments, like Jason using these hot dogs as nunchucks. We get Bulk essentially being this like bull while Zach does this matador thing. And it's really stupid. But we do get this like pretty funny fight with the Rangers using their weapons against Pudgy Pig, only for it to eat their weapons. And we get the pig attacking the food court to where it just eats all the food there except for the spicy food, which gives the Rangers their solution to this conflict, where now their plan is to force feed him spicy radish by sneaking into a sub that is very Japanesey, and you can very much tell that this was a Japanese show and not an American show, as they definitely would have handled this differently. But again, the Sentai footage has them throwing this massive radish in a sub into its mouth where it pukes out all their weapons and they defeat it there. Again, a really dumb episode, but one that's like super iconic to me. But following this, again, we just get a large series of pretty unnotable filler. I mean, Big Sisters is this episode between Kim and Trini, to where they end up taking care of this kid that obviously gets kidnapped, to where you can clearly tell it's a different kid in the Sentai footage. Though also it's like, well, if they're gonna kidnap a kid, why are you kidnapping the kid that the Power Rangers are taking care of? That's really stupid. But also, even beyond that, this is an episode that introduces us to the Rad Bug, a flying car that Billy has made somehow. So that's something. Episode 8 focuses around Billy's brother, I guess. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, it's supposed to be Billy's brother, but, like, it never is explicitly said. But either way, he gets DQ'd from a science fair, but really just ends up being another generic kid that's used for Sentai footage. From Whom the Bell Tolls ends up being this strange episode focusing around Hobby Week, to where Trini shows off her dolls, and her doll ends up becoming a monster and captures things in bottles. It's just really weird. Happy Birthday Zach is a filler that I remembered very much liking back in the day, though watching it now it's just kind of fine. But obviously focuses around Zach, who is disappointed that everyone's forgetting about his birthday, and this leads to him being separated from the other Rangers and getting a pretty great fight against the monster of the day here. But as a whole, not as great of an episode as I remembered. No Clowning Around is kind of just a boring episode that largely takes place at a fair, and they're just fighting around the fair. Again, not much of intrigue there. Power Ranger Punks is an episode that I very much remembered liking as a kid, where Billy and Kim end up being brainwashed and end up being punks, which is just a ridiculous episode and realistically not a great one, though it is one of the more memorable ones to me. Peace, Love, and Woe is a really dumb episode where we get our first of many Billy love interests for the series, where Billy talks about not wanting to take a girl to the dance, only for him to bump into a girl who is from the Accelerated Baby Genius program, because every girl that is attracted to Billy needs to be this really dorky girl. While Playing the Sky ends up being a pretty notable episode to me, even though it's kind of a dumb one, where one thing to mention here is the fact that Bryan Cranston does voice the antagonist, obviously before he becomes the well-known name he is now. Though beyond that, a lot of this episode does focus around Kimberly being taken on a private plane by her Uncle Steve, to which Bulk and Skull end up asking to join them, to which they just accept for some reason. And obviously Steve ends up getting dizzy to where Kim has to land the plane, and it's a notable storyline there. This is also the episode where Angela gets introduced, who is Zach's love interest, and really most of her time on the season is Zach failing to court her, though really she ends up being a pretty irrelevant character by the end of it. Episode 15, Dark Warrior, ends up focusing on Billy being bullied to where he wants to learn martial arts, which, wasn't that literally the premiere? But here, Trainee's uncle just so happens to also be a scientist and a martial artist, where he ends up training him, which is just kind of stupid. But again, dumb episode. Switching Places ends up being another kind of notable episode, though again, very tropey, of Kim and Billy swapping bodies, to which obviously leads to some humor, though outside of that, pretty generic. But with that, we finally get to episode 17, where the story finally progresses in what is one of the most notable series of episodes in the entire series, that being Green with Evil. A 5-part series, an insane thing to think about, a 5-part story for a TV show, something I don't think you ever really see beyond this, at least in the sense that they're named parts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and even beyond that, ends up being aired in a really interesting way, where this is a point where Power Rangers started to get aired on every weekday. So through that, this 5-episode series was aired throughout the course of a singular week. And I do think this is a series of episodes that really boosted Power Rangers to the lexicon. I do think it finally had Power Rangers telling this overarching storyline, again, one that took place over these 5 episodes, but also ends up introducing us to the most popular character in the history of the show, that being Tommy, who obviously becomes the Green Ranger, and obviously he ends up staying on the show until Turbo. It ends up being the icon of the series moving forward, obviously being portrayed by Jason David Frank, which rest in peace, though he really ends up becoming the star of the show, which is very interesting considering the fact that he ends up not being on the show that much despite that. And a lot of that comes down to Sentai footage, but we'll talk about that later. But Tommy ends up being this really interesting character here, essentially being the first time that the Rangers are facing off against someone like them. Again, they had previously been facing off just against these generic monsters or these putties. However, this ends up being an antagonist that is literally another ranger, another teenager, one that comes off as just a badass here, someone that seems to match Jason in this karate match they have at the beginning of the episode. We also get introduced to Kimberly's crush on Tommy, which obviously blossoms into a relationship moving forward. But also we see Tommy fending off Bulk and Skull from Kim. And all this is a great introduction to Tommy, only for Tommy to later be brainwashed by Rita, becoming the Green Ranger, in footage that very much is clearly taken from the Sentai, with it literally just being Burai in the revival scene. Though here Tommy ends up breaking into Command Center and ends up destroying it to the point where they disconnect them from Zordon. And we end the episode with Tommy completely overpowering the Rangers, jumping into their Megazord and kicking them out of the cockpit and fighting them on the ground, defeating them. Again, this really great overall episode here that really sets up this giant threat that Tommy is, which I do think is also a shame, as I don't think any of the episodes following this really match to this. Again, while Green with Evil was definitely a highlight of this season, probably 5 of the best episodes of this season, I do feel like episode 1 of this was by far the best, where episode 2 is fine. Tommy obviously just changes in character, and people don't seem to realize that he's turned evil for some reason, where he's a complete dick to Kim now, yet she doesn't suspect anything's wrong just yet for some reason. We have Tommy having to fight off against some putties to earn the Sword of Darkness, which later gets tied to his connection to Rita, which makes no sense as he was turned evil before that, but whatever, I guess. But here you have Tommy kidnapping Jason, to where Jason ends up having to fight Goldar without his morpher, which ends up being a pretty notable moment, even though it is one that is extremely dragged out, where it really ends up taking up a lot of episodes 2 and 3 of Green with Evil here. But part 3 also ends up being the introduction to Scorpina, who is probably one of the most irrelevant antagonists in Power Rangers history, as she's there. She shows up when she needs to due to Sentai footage, but also she has like nothing to actually do on this season, even though she is propped up as this massive threat here. But obviously the Jason Goldar fight ends with Jason being teleported just in time. And we have Scorpina attacking the warehouse district that is filled with empty warehouses because people don't die in Power Rangers. And it surprisingly looks just like Japan. Who would have guessed? Now, episode 4 ends up being another low point for the Rangers, where we have them failing to find Zordon, and there being a power surge that makes it so they can't morph for some reason. But this is just like followed by Billy just immediately fixing it, which is just really stupid. But again, more fights against Putties and Scorpina. We have Alpha finally finding Zordon, only for Tommy to break in again and ruin the command center again, which again, it does feel like this is kind of dragging on a bit at this point. And we do get some weird implementation of some Sentai footage with Bulk and Skull trying to escape from the city while driving a bus, only for us to then cut the Sentai footage of Goldar picking up a bus and it trying to pretend like Bulk and Skull are in the bus, even though the buses look nothing alike. But again, that's Power Rangers for you. There also ends up being this strange thing in this episode too, where the Megazord ends up fighting against Scorpina and Goldar, only for the Megazord to lose power because of an eclipse, I guess. I guess that's a thing that happens. Like, you would think that they would plan for situations like this. But this leads to Rita growing the Green Ranger himself, to which this ends up being a pretty cool visual. The Green Ranger fighting against the Megazord and defeating it, to which it falls into a chasm, I guess. But the episode obviously ends with the realization that Tommy is the Green Ranger, because for some reason they didn't already figure that out. And now for part 5, which, I mean, has all the makings of an all-time great episode, definitely conceptually, and the fact that it is this culmination of this Green with Evil storyline, you would think it would be, but there's so many dumb plot points in this episode. But either way, we have Kim and Tommy fighting at the bar where she confronts him, and it's really stupid that no one picks up on the fact that they're Power Rangers through this. But also, out of nowhere here, we have Rita calling on the Dragon Zord, because the Dragon Zord existed and just for some reason never got called until now. But eventually we have the Rangers finding Zordon, to which we are given the reveal that the Zords are revived somehow. And we also learn that destroying the Sword of Darkness will break the spell, even though again the spell was put on him before he got the Sword of Darkness. But either way, Jason destroys the sword and Tommy becomes good, now having Tommy join the Rangers, being the 6th Ranger, to which we get really cheesy acting and them morphing just to do poses, which is really stupid. And we have Zordon saying the prophecy has been fulfilled, which I guess that's a thing that they just never mention outside this. And this is followed by, just for some reason, Zordon making Dragon Zord go into battle mode for some reason. Like, it makes no sense. Like, why is any of this happening? It's essentially as if the writers are just saying, hey, this is a toy you can buy. Like, it really serves no actual narrative purpose here. But anyway, following this, we get more filler, obviously. Though we do get some pretty notable ones. I mean, the Trouble Shell Shock ends up being this fight against a turtle with a traffic light in his head, and I always found that really stupid but funny. But this also brings us to another aspect of the season that is pretty interesting due to the Sentai footage, and that is the fact that Tommy, despite being a full-blown Ranger and part of the team now, usually doesn't end up joining the fights until the very end. And a lot of that reason is because of the original character of Burai, where in the Sentai he was a character that was dying, and that through leaving his cave he would drain his lifespan. So through that, Burai wasn't used unless he was absolutely necessary. And obviously because of that, there's a lot less footage to use of the Green Ranger. So through that, they had to constantly write excuses for Tommy not to be in these fights. Which I don't know if you noticed this if you originally watched the show without context. However, rewatching it now with that knowledge, like, you notice it every single episode that there's always this really dumb excuse for Tommy to not be there with the rest of the group. It's all really kind of dumb, but I mean, the next filler episode just ends up being pretty straight up boring. Itsy Bitsy Spider just focuses around saving a statue. It's like, who cares? The Spit Flower ends up being a pretty decent filler episode, largely because it does progress the Kim and Tommy relationship, where Kim designs a float for a parade, to which it ends up getting destroyed, only for Tommy to, by the end of the episode, end up repairing it for her. And again, I felt like that was a nice progression of their relationship. Though there is a point in the episode where it is just stupid that Tommy's not involved, where they go to the command center where Zordon just tells Tommy to stay in case the Rangers fail, which is like, why? That's just stupid, but whatever. Life's a Masquerade is an episode that I've always personally liked. I remember loving this episode as a kid, it being the Halloween episode, which does have some dumb humor from it, especially from the monster of this episode being a Frankenstein monster, where Tommy's missing because he's putting together his costume, which ends up being a Frankenstein monster. But also this episode ends up introducing super putties, which are pretty irrelevant. And funnily, the next episode, Gung Ho, also has them reintroducing the super putties as if they didn't appear in the previous episode, because that's Power Rangers. But also, since it being another really strange episode, one that focuses on the Tommy and Jason relationship, one that is pretty weird when you think about it, in the sense that obviously these are the two like stars of the show. However, at the same time, they're two people that we know from post-show that they did not get along. Jason David Frank and Austin St. John, the actors, really did not like each other, to where even right before Jason David Frank's passing, we do have them still taking shots at each other. However, we do get numerous episodes that are focused on their relationship, with this one specifically being focused on getting them to work together. Those also ends up being the introduction to Titanus, the carrier Zord, that doesn't really do that much, though it is really funny that he comes off as this antagonistic figure here, only for Zoran to say, hey, it was a test and he's a friend, which is like, okay, I guess. But also, like, the overall plot has like Tommy and Jason working together to win this fighting match, to which they're facing off against some ninjas that are led by Bulk and Skull, which is just also weird, but overall like a notable episode in my eyes. Find that we get a really dumb filler episode in Wheel of Misfortune, an episode where the Rangers are part of a play, I guess, and Kim brings her grandma's spinning wheel as a prop, to which Bulk ends up ruining it, and Rita decides to use it as one of her monsters, I guess. Kind of boring. Those does end up being the first appearance of Ultra Zord, which has the Mega Dragon Zord merging with Titanus. Again, a pretty cool visual, though kind of a weird random point for them to start using it though. Following this, we get to another two-parter, though one that doesn't really progress the plot that much, and that being Island of Illusion, an episode where Rita calls on Lokar, this floating head monster thing that doesn't really get much background here, though in the original Sentai it was actually supposed to be the main antagonist of the entire series, with Vendora working for him instead of the other way around, though again, the actual episode ends up being kind of lame. It's just the Rangers are teleported to this Island of Illusion, where if they don't believe in themselves, then they're gonna fade away forever, and we have this little person named Quagmire that helps them through it, and it's just weird. But obviously they end up escaping and defeat Lokar with the Ultra Zord. Again, just kind of bland. But again, after this, more filler. The Rock Star ends up being an episode of Jason teaching his cousin karate, to which I should mention that most of the kids in this show end up being dubbed over, which is really weird. I believe it was due to money reasons, where it's cheaper to get these kids that didn't get the talk and getting these voice actors to dub over their voices than it was to actually just pay these kids outright, which is just stupid. But again, that's Power Rangers for you, especially early on, of them cutting every corner they can cut. But again, mostly lame episode. Calamity Kimberly ends up being another pretty solid Kim and Tommy episode, where Kimberly is having bad luck, I guess, and Tommy comes to her rescue, which again was a nice continuation of their relationship. A Star is Born ends up being this weird episode where Tommy tries out for a karate commercial, to which I guess he gets the role, though that role ends up being literally just his audition being used in the commercial. It's just weird, but also ends up just being a weird episode just all around, where obviously that ends up preoccupying Tommy, to where the Rangers end up fighting Scorpina, and we end up getting this Megazord fight, only for them to chase Scorpina immediately afterwards on the ground, only for them to then grow a monster and then call on their Zords again, which is just stupid. The following episode ends up being the Yolks on You, to where we have this weird monster that wants to find its eggs, and again, it was just kind of boring. But then the story finally progresses once again through the Green Candle, another two-parter, where all of a sudden Rita brings out this green candle that through lighting it, she can take away Tommy's powers somehow. And with that, we also have Tommy getting kidnapped by Rita, and Rita gaining control of the Dragon Zord, to which Jason now plans on breaking back into Rita's palace in order to regain Tommy's powers, to which Jason and Goldar end up fighting once again here. However, he's not able to stop the candle in time, being forced to retreat, which ends up obviously causing Tommy to lose his powers here. obviously being a necessity for the Sentai, as obviously, again, Tommy's counterpart, Burai, actually ends up dying in the original Sentai. So because of that, they didn't have any Tommy footage left to use, though it kind of ended up being for the better. Because while Tommy was the star of the show and him being gone, obviously, was looked at as a hit for the show, I do think the ability to later bring him back as they do and really hype that up really probably end up leading to even more hype for Tommy moving forward. This also ends up being the first time that Tommy and Kim kiss on screen, being one of the few times ever that Power Rangers allowed a kiss on screen. Following this, we get Birds of a Feather, another episode of Zack training a kid, and that's kind of lame, though we do get a pretty notable moment from this episode of Jason using Tommy's powers, using the power shield and the dragon dagger to defeat the monster, so that's kind of cool. Next up, we get Cleanup Club, an episode following around Trini, who wants to stop pollution, and we get this weird cleanup montage of the Rangers like flipping around as they're cleaning things, which is weird, but not super notable of an episode. We then get A Bad Reflection on You, another episode where Bryan Cranston voices the monster, to which Rita ends up creating these Ranger clones who end up being bullies in school, and the Rangers are given detention, and all this is just kind of stupid. And again, just kind of a generic one there. But then we get to the two-part, what would have been finale of the season, that being Doomsday. And two of my favorite episodes of the season. Again, really feeling that there's actually stakes to this episode, though again, the storytelling of it as a whole is a bit of a mess. But again, this was originally supposed to be the finale of the series, to where this ends up using footage from the final few episodes of Zyuranger, where Rita ends up reviving a Zord named Cyclopsis that is to be piloted by Goldar here, which is a change from the Sentai. In the original Sentai, Bandora was able to revive her son, who ended up piloting Cyclopsis, which I believe for Power Rangers, the initial plan when this was going to be the finale was for it to not be Goldar and for it to be another character here, though obviously that was scrapped. But this ends up being Power Ranger Day, to where the city of Angel Grove is celebrating the Power Rangers, to which that obviously leads to the entire city being kidnapped. But here we also see, again, heightened stakes through Rita's palace arriving on Earth, crashing in the middle of the city. We have the Zords being overpowered by Cyclopsis until they bring out the Ultra Zord and just defeat it anyway, which is just kind of stupid. And that's followed by more stupidity with Rita using her staff to somehow sink Titanus and it exploding, which doesn't really make sense how that happened. And the episode ends with her resummoning Lokars, as again, Lokar was the main antagonist of the main series, which Lokar is able to recreate Cyclopsis, I guess. And we get to Doomsday Part 2, where for some reason the Zords are only at half power at this point, and they have to wait 12 hours for it to restore, again for some reason. But then they decide to use the Megazord anyway, fighting against Lokar, and are easily defeated in what is a pretty cool battle here, one where the Megazord's arm is sliced off and the Dragonzord's tail gets cut off. Again, pretty interesting to see the Zords actually get damaged here. However, this is followed by Rita blasting the Zords, to which they end up disappearing, again making you think, oh my god, the Zords are destroyed, only for us to get the reveal that this was a backup for the Zords, I guess, is that they would disappear when they're out of power, which is definitely just a made-up storyline there to explain their disappearance and for them to not even properly explain how they got them back. But either way, Rangers are able to call an Ultra Zord again and defeat that Cyclopsis again, which is just kind of a lame outcome to all this. But again, at least there were more stakes to this. It's definitely one of the better episodes of the season, even though there's still dumb things that happen throughout it. And we do end the episode with a Tommy cameo as he congratulates the Rangers as the Power Ranger Day celebrations proceed, and we have the Rangers being given the choice by Zordon on whether or not they want to continue to be Rangers, to where Jason says there's no decision to be made. Where again, originally this was going to be the finale of the season, and really a finale to the series if it didn't get picked up. However, obviously the series was a success, and through that, they decided to, for some reason, order 20 more episodes. To where, again, this would have been a nice spot to end everything off of, a fitting conclusion, a solid ending point for the season, but then it just drags on. Which leads us to another talking point from this season, which is how they made 20 more episodes. As is, they already pretty much ran out of Sentai footage. They had used up most of the original run of Zyuranger. So you would think, okay, how are they going to make more of this show? And you would think, okay, maybe they'll go to a different Sentai and use footage from that, which they obviously later end up doing. But no, for some reason, their first inclination is, hey, we're going to contact the makers of Super Sentai and make them make original footage for us. Which doesn't lessen the point of the show and why it was made to begin with, of how cheap it was. But either way, they literally end up contacting them to make exclusive footage for them, which ends up being most of the footage that's used in the back half of the season and some of the first half of season 2 is this Ju 2 footage, as it's dubbed by the fan base now, of, again, footage of the Ju Ranger suits fighting against these new monsters, and then Megazord footage that was filmed exclusively for Power Rangers here. This really strange concept that they decided to go out of their way to contact the original creators to make more footage for them, which I assume must have cost a decent chunk for Power Rangers to do. So it is really weird they went with this route over just like using a different Sentai footage, as we later see them do for the following season, which really also post Doomsday, it really just signifies the downfall of the season for me, where like really none of these episodes following this are really that good. They're all basic filler. Well, there's a couple that might be like above average. It's all pretty bad. And what's even weirder is that we actually have 2 episodes here to start off that don't even have Ju2 footage in it, as they didn't have it ready yet. And because that, we get 2 of the dumbest filler episodes in the series. We get Rita's Seed of Evil being a filler episode that really takes footage from a lot of episodes, which makes the episode come off as a jumbled mess, along with the following episode, a all-time bad episode in my eyes, that being a pig surprise. An episode that has the return of Pudgy Pig and them literally using the same footage as Food Fight. It's literally the exact same footage, them just editing around certain aspects of it, particularly the eating of the weapons. And it's just so stupid that this is actually a thing they did. They really just essentially remade an episode without making you think that they remade an episode. And the episode ends with Pudgy Pig falling in love with a real pig. And it's like, this is so stupid. By the way, following this, we get to Something Fishy, the start of the Ju2 footage, which obviously the fact that the Ju2 footage was made with Power Rangers in mind. There are a couple things that were added here. They did end up adding character traits from the characters to the Ranger portrayals here. And also you can see like the Kim and Tommy relationship being there. You have this weird quirk that's there for almost every episode of Billy creating like a special weapon that he ends up using to defeat some of these monsters, in the sense of just being a reoccurring trend with most of these episodes. But here we do end up having Billy being scared of fish because a fish bit him as a kid, so I guess that's a thing. But he obviously overcomes his fear by defeating the fish monster, to which we do get a pretty lengthy Megazord fight during this episode, obviously due to the Ju2 footage. So at the same time, you can very much tell the footage is different from the original Megazord footage, with the Megazord itself moving a lot slower than it did in the original Ju Ranger footage. But also this ends up being the episode where I did start to notice that we get some of the more iconic Ron Wasserman songs being used, where something I haven't mentioned at all yet is the music of Power Rangers, which I do think is really great early on, mostly composed by Ron Wasserman, who obviously makes the theme song of the show, Go Go Power Rangers, one of the most catchy kid themes in my eyes. But even beyond that, composes a lot of the better songs used for fight sequences, with songs like Fight and We Need a Hero making their appearance in the back half of this season, which end up being really iconic songs to me. But beyond this, again, just more filler. We get Lions and Blizzards, which ends up being an episode focused around Zach and him having a date with Angela, only for Angela to dump popcorn on him by the end of the episode. Crystal of Nightmares ends up being an episode where the Rangers are given nightmares, to which it causes them to lose their confidence for some reason. And also we have Bulk and Skull getting detention forever because of bad grades. I guess that's the thing that happens. It's like a really stupid episode. The Flea or Not the Flea ends up being an episode where the youth center is about to go out of business, and we get this really over the top acting from Ernie about how depressed he is, only for the end of the episode to have them saving a dog, to which the owner of that dog ends up giving Ernie a whole bunch of money, to which it's enough to make them not go out of business, I guess. Like, that was just so stupid. Reign of the Jellyfish ends up being an episode of the Rangers class putting together a time capsule, to which a picture of the Rangers is being put into the time capsule, to which Rita is insulted and decides to try to force a picture of herself into the time capsule, which is just so stupid that Rita cares about this. Plague of the Mantis ends up being an episode focused around Trini, with her learning Kung Fu and being told to only win in a fair fight, and this leads to the Mantis monster using this against her, and that's just kind of stupid as well. But following this, we get to the last two-parter of the season, that being Return of an Old Friend, where it ends up being Parents' Day, where all the Rangers' parents are there, who are all dressed exactly the same as the Rangers, wearing the same colors, and this is so stupid. But here we do get content about Kimberly being upset that her parents are divorced, and we get this sequence of Kimberly not thinking her parents are going to show up because they got divorced, and her thinking it's her fault, only for her to realize that they did show up, and that's kind of a nothing point of the episode, though it does get a lot of focus on early on. But eventually, the parents get kidnapped, obviously. To which Billy also ends up getting brainwashed into stealing the dragon dagger and giving it to Goldar, and also ends up holding the Rangers' parents up for ransom, to where if they don't give him the power coins, he'll kill their parents. To which this episode obviously has them giving up their power coins, only for Goldar to not bring their parents back anyway. And we end up having this weird cliffhanger to the episode where it's literally Tommy walking into the youth center, to where they end up playing the Go Green Ranger music. So again, obviously them hyping up Tommy's reappearance here. And part 2 ends up largely focusing on Tommy, with Zordon being able to bring back Tommy's powers, which is like, again, if he could do that, why didn't he do that earlier? Like, I know they say Zordon loses a lot of power from this, and obviously this is just a temporary fix, so it's like, also, you could have done this earlier. But either way, Tommy barely escapes with the power coins, and the Rangers use their power coins to revive Zordon because they can, I guess. Again, a fine enough two-parter, though really not anything too special. And again, the rest of the season's filler. We get Grumpy Bee, an episode of Billy being upset at getting a B, because that's Billy for you. We get Two Heads Are Better Than One, another Tommy and Jason filler episode of them teaching the moms of Angel Grove self-defense for some reason. And like, this episode also has this like weird deviation of Tommy going on this like side quest to find this exotic fruit in order to defeat the monster, to which he's able to get it from Ernie, because Ernie just started selling exotic drinks, which is stupid. But next up, we get to Foul Play, an episode that is focused on Zach, where again he thinks that he's on a date with Angela, only for him to find out that this date is them just taking the kids from the youth center to the movies, which he ends up being disappointed by. Following this, we get Trick or Treat, a notable episode, but a really stupid one where Kim gets on the game show Trick or Treat, to which her opponent is conveniently Skull, during which the actual game show ends up being them having to ask the host that's dressed as a vampire questions that he won't know the answer to, which is just a stupid concept. But also at the same time, Tommy's in this karate competition, to where both end up having to leave their competitions before they're done to fight the monsters, both of them having to lose out because of that. But this also ends up being the episode with the pumpkin wrapper monster, which is just so stupid. Zordon literally saying the lines, "It will distract you with its clever raps and rhymes," to which we get the response of, "Rita has some evil tricks this time." It's like, this is so stupid. And like, the episode literally ends with like Bulk and Skull having won the car that was the prize for the game show due to Kim leaving, only for them to then lose the car because they cheated, which like, all this is super stupid. Obviously, we do get Second Chance, actually like competent filler episode, one that has Jason and Zach helping out this kid Roger who didn't make the soccer team, and convinces Ernie to give him a second chance. Though I do find it weird, the entire Ranger team just starts to care about Roger now, despite the fact they didn't even know who he was at the beginning of the episode. But here we end up having this Sockadillo monster, this armadillo that goes into a soccer ball and attacks the Rangers, which they keep him getting knocked around by it in its ball form, which is just so stupid. But I don't know, I did have fun rewatching this episode, even though the fact that Roger ends up becoming the captain of the soccer team following this is just all kind of dumb. But then we get to On Fins and Needles, an episode that has Tommy and Jason teaching karate again, to which the entire episode's focused on Rita putting a spell on them to make them hate each other, which is funny considering they actually did. But outside of that, again, mostly bland filler episode. Enter the Lizinator ends up being an episode focused around Kimberly's cousin trying to be a cheerleader and Kim having to cheer her up, to which Her cousin is constantly talking about how good of a cheerleader Kimberly used to be and how they still talk about her, which is just kind of stupid. And also the monster ends up being the Lizinator, who ends up being just blatant parody of Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is just really weird. And the final conflict here ends up being defeated by Kim's cousin ending up using the cheers to tire out Squat and Babu to allow her to escape, which is all just really dumb too. It's like a really kind of dumb episode, but kind of enjoyable to a degree. Next up, we got football season, where it's obviously football season, and all the men on the Ranger team are trying out for the football team for some reason, and Tommy's not confident he'll be on the team as he has no experience, and ends up getting trained by Ernie, to which he ends up making the team at the end of the episode, because obviously, to which he's also named this star quarterback, because also, obviously. Finally, we get Mighty Morphin Mutants, another episode of Rita trying to create evil rangers here, and they're for some reason being these evil rangers led by a crayfish. So that's something. And also another dumb aspect of this episode is that Alpha ends up giving them some stronger weapons, which literally just ends up being the same weapons, just supposedly stronger. And all that's stupid too. But finally we get to the finale of the entire season, which is a filler episode, that being an oyster stew. Episode largely focused on Zach trying to court Angela once again, getting her to do a double date with Tommy and Kim, to which Zach ends up trying to buy her jewelry, not being able to afford one from an actual store, so he buys it from a sketchy guy in the park, who turns out to be a disguised putty, I guess. And this episode ends up being really stupid in the fact that Angela just hates their date until the point that he pulls out the jewelry to where all of a sudden now she's in love with Zach. Again, the entire way that relationships are portrayed on Power Rangers is just so bizarre. But either way, pretty boring filler episode outside that. And again, it ends up being a really lackluster ending to season 1 to me, where I do feel like if it was just the original run, the first 40 episodes, I do think I could say that, okay, this is at least a solid season. While again, there's not much progression in the overall plot throughout a lot of this, it's still a pretty nicely compact season. However, I do think the following 20 episodes really just stretch out this season to the point where I do think it ends up harming my opinions of the season as a whole. Now, at the end of the day, it's still not a highly rated season of Power Rangers to me. While it is a very nostalgic season, it's not one I fully click with, but there definitely are some obviously major high points. Again, Green with Evil, Doomsday, the Green Candle is pretty solid, but just the wide range of filler episodes and the fact that so many of them are largely mediocre is something that does definitely taint my overall opinion of the season. But there we go. That's the entire season of Mighty Morphin Season 1. Now, moving forward, I do plan on continuing on with these yearly from this point on, doing Season 2 next year, Season 3, and then obviously Zeo, Turbo, In Space, and beyond. However, I've also just in general been wanting to do more Power Ranger videos where, I've been pretty detached from the series for a while. However, with this being the 30th anniversary of the series, I did decide that now is finally time for me to do a season ranking of Power Rangers, to where I will be doing that later in the year, probably after the release of Cosmic Fury, and also even beyond that, I have a couple other Power Ranger videos that ideally I would like to do at some point. I just don't know how likely it is that I'll do them anytime soon, but again, ideally I'd like to do them, so maybe stay tuned for that. Obviously, just stay tuned for more the general reality TV, video game stuff that I typically do on the channel anyway, but for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.